Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Adam, and I'll be your moderator. Dr. Stephen Vorholt is our speaker today, and he'll be discussing 3D printing and guided implant surgery. If at any point you have a question, please type it into the box labeled "Have a Question," and we'll do live Q&A at the end. If you'd like to talk with other attendees, navigate to your control panel at the bottom of your screen and click the chat icon. And lastly, Sprintray is sponsoring today's webinar. Dr. Vorholt, take it away.
All right, thank you, Adam. Welcome, everybody that has made it on. Most East Coasters, I assume, or people who aren't working on the West Coast. I'm Dr. Stephen Vorholt. I'm going to be talking today about 3D printing and some guided implant surgery and kind of how we can avoid complications. I'm going to talk about a couple of complications that I've had doing guided surgery and some things that we can maybe avoid the pitfalls on. And take a good look at my picture there because you won't see my face tonight. I was talking to Adam earlier, and my one laptop with a webcam does not have a mic. So we switched to mic instead of my face, which I think will be better for everybody involved. So if you don't know me, I'm Stephen Vorholt. Like I said, I'm a diplomat of the American Board of Oral Implantology. I would encourage anybody who is involved in implant dentistry to get into the credentialing process through the AAID and the ABOI. Meet some people, network, join a group of like-minded individuals, and kind of show off to your patients the extra work you've put into it. I'm also a lead instructor at Implant Pathway down in Tempe, Arizona. So I'm there full-time teaching a lot of the courses alongside my good friend and colleague, Dr. Justin Moody. So tonight we're going to talk about 3D printing. So let's talk about the objectives. So tonight we want to understand the advantages and disadvantages of guided surgery. A lot of people that learn about guided surgery or go to webinars about guided surgery, they just talk about the good stuff. And there are things we need to be aware of that are downfalls of guided surgery. We'll talk about several examples, and one very important one that I think hopefully everyone will at least take home from this webinar. We're also going to talk about the workflow for guided surgery: design, creation, and use. You as a doctor and a surgeon can be as involved in this as you want to be, right? You don't necessarily need to do the design or do the creation, whether you're 3D printing or whatnot, but you should certainly understand it because that's how we can avoid certain pitfalls, right? It's like being in dental school and being forced to wax up our first denture. I doubt many of us here, if we're doing dentures, are still waxing up and setting our own teeth and casting dentures and stuff like that. But it's important to know the steps involved, right? That's what makes us true professionals. So we'll go over kind of what happens behind the scenes if you're not the one doing it, so you can understand all the parts and pieces. I'll introduce you to the Sprintray lineup. Like Adam mentioned, Sprintray is a sponsor of this webinar, so we'll be focusing on Sprintray's 3D printing tools and pieces of equipment. I've been a Sprintray user since 2016 with one of their first Moonrays in my private practice. When I had a private practice back in Ohio, I've been a huge fan ever since, and it's amazing to see the growth they've had and continue to have. And then we're going to talk about how to leverage that technology if you choose to bring it into your office to increase surgical guide usage and to lower the cost to yourselves and potentially to your patients if you so choose to pass that on to them. And lastly, we'll talk about handling some common complications and focusing more on complications that might happen through guided surgery. Okay, so let's get into it. Guided surgery, we'll talk about what guided surgery is and what guided surgery is not. And one of the first things everyone thinks about is that it's a profitable practice builder. And when you, obviously, we know we can charge for a guide. I couldn't tell you the CDT code off the top of my head right now, but there's a code that you can bill out if you're a PPO or even if you're fee for service. Average cost is probably $300 to $500 that most offices are charging, and you're getting it from a lab from anywhere from $40 to $200, and if you do it yourself, we can get the cost down close to $20. So it can be a very profitable practice builder in that regard. And then just having your patients kind of see that you're going the extra mile, right? That you have the technology, that alone is a practice builder. And I would assert that the same thing is true with cone beam technology or any sort of CAD/CAM milling or anything that's a little bit high tech, right? It's also a stress reducer. Once you get comfortable with whatever guided kit or guided system you prefer to use, it can make things a lot simpler. The kit can kind of streamline some stuff. You've kind of already done the surgery in your head or on a computer before you see the patient. That's usually how I'll position it to the patient. I'm going to do the surgery myself on you digitally several times. I'm going to get it perfect, and then when we finally do the surgery on you, it'll have been the 5th or 10th time that we've even done this, so it'll be a piece of cake. And also for the team, because if the team feels comfortable with things, it's going to be a big advantage. Okay, it's easier to do this in-house than it ever has. When I first started doing implant surgery, I didn't do guided. I was taught by my mentors to learn freehand first, which I still agree is a very valuable thing to understand how to do, but it was expensive. I was a Sirona office, and if we were going to use Sirona to make our guides, I think the cost was $200, $300, and it was more for every implant you decided to use. And it took a couple weeks to get the guides back from Germany or wherever they were selling them at the time. So nowadays, fast forward 5 years, you can do this in office in less than a couple hours if you so chose to. Okay, it's certainly more accurate than freehand. Plenty of studies out there in the literature showing that. It's not drop dead accurate. There are some minor inconsistencies that we need to be aware of. And I would definitely, when I teach freehand courses, which is most of what we teach at our live surgical portions, I always stress to people that you should not be reaching for the guide only when you need to absolutely nail it. I'm a firm believer that you should probably do mostly guided or all freehand, because you need to be comfortable doing guided surgery and not only use it when you really got to nail it. So, but it is more accurate, and we'll talk about ways it's more accurate and ways to make sure it stays accurate. Okay, it's shorter surgery. Patients love that, right? So your team loves that. You can do more in less time, and that also helps obviously with the profit, because everything in dentistry, when you break it down, is really a per hour kind of per appointment per hour, the profitability of that. Okay, I think it's fantastic for simple cases with ample bone and good access. So if the patient can open wide, you can fit the drills in there. We're not trying to thread the needle. I think it's a great adjunct for simple cases with ample bone. And I think it's also probably the only and best way to really do prosthetically driven implant surgery. We get a digital wax up or have some sort of model that we can import into our software, or the lab does, and now we can put a guide that's going to put us right in the right position. So when it comes to prosthetically driven treatment planning, a guide is a no-brainer. What is guided surgery not? Well, it's not appropriate for everything. We'll talk about some examples where it's maybe not appropriate, but small opening, patients who can't open very wide, tight spaces, really trying to nail it. Maybe some of the full arch stuff, especially on the lower. Guided surgery is not a panacea, right? It doesn't solve every problem. So it's not a cure for all problems. You can still have issues with bone. You can certainly still have issues with grafting or pulling teeth. Implants fail at the same rate doing it guided versus non-guided. So it's not the cure. It's not going to make you 100%. It's certainly not a replacement for skill and experience. I know a lot of people start guided, or their mentors tell them to begin guided. I usually kind of lean the other way and say start partially guided. So I'll tell people who are just starting to get a pilot guide for everything, because I want you to have the guide do the hard part, which is put the implant in the right spot, and then you get used to the drills and the feel of the bone and kind of how to use the kit. And then once you've done 25 of those, you can decide if you want to go fully guided or not. But it's not a replacement, so you still need to get those skills. You don't want to get so comfortable or reliant on a guide that if something goes wrong, you're suddenly, out of depth. Okay, it's not foolproof. Things can go wrong. Things have certainly gone wrong in my hands, and I've seen it go wrong in others' hands. We'll talk about some of those examples. I said that it's more accurate than freehand, but look at the lit. There's still a couple tenths of millimeters that we're going to have some leeway and some give. And what I've learned the longer I've done implant surgery is if you understand the freehand surgery, or you understand why drills go where they go, we'll talk about this in more detail, you can avoid a lot of this problem, right? Trying to, just a quick example, if we're drilling against a really thick lingual plate, for instance, and we plan the implant right where we want it to be, which happens to be engaging or halfway in the lingual plate, well, that's not physically going to happen. The drills will refuse to drill through the lingual plate. They will get pushed aside from it. And so what you thought was the perfect guided surgery is still getting forced. Your hand is still getting forced because we have to respect the hard tissue, the bone, the biology, and the actual surgical outcome. So things like that. We don't want to just become like, oh, if I put it in the software, that's where it's going to go. Okay, that's not the case. And certainly they have failures as well. So some of the main advantages, if you bring this in-house and you buy the 3D printer, maybe some of you already have 3D printers, maybe a lot of you are considering looking into bringing 3D printing into your office, it can certainly bring down your costs and increase your profitability for implant surgery. I think it means less cement retained restorations. So if you're doing it freehand, posterior teeth, and the angle's off by just a little bit, it wouldn't take much, where you or your lab decide, hey, we're going to have to do a custom abutment and a cement retained crown. Well, suddenly we're bringing in a different variable that could lead to more complications and more stress, because cementing implants is not like cementing natural teeth, and it can lead to complications and even implant failure if done poorly. Whereas if we do it guided, maybe we're already pretty convinced we're going to be able to do screw retained. We get things parallel to the adjacent contacts, and it's cheaper, right? We're not paying for custom abutments and a crown, so we can save a little bit of money there too, and restorative stress as well. When the team stress is lower and your team starts to see, wow, that was a really smooth surgery, that was only half an hour, there was minimal bleeding, there wasn't a lot of suturing, or the results look really good, they start to accept it, and that makes your case acceptance goes up, because everybody knows you can be a great salesman or you can be a great explainer, but the second you leave the room, the patient immediately turns to the hygienist or the assistant and says, hey, do they really do this very well, or is it actually as pain-free as they say? And you want your team to be on board, maybe more than anything else, because if they're on board from the front desk to the back, it's going to really make things kick off. And then we'll talk about a case I did that you can go from consult to surgery in less than 9 minutes with guided, with in-office Sprintray materials. So we'll have a case where a young woman came in with a broken tooth, and in less than 90 minutes we were able to do the surgery fully guided, which is maybe the time for them to have a seat, get an x-ray, get the patient numb, get the tooth out, and you finish up your other patients because you squeeze this one in. So we'll talk about that example and how it works. Okay, so what do you need to do for the digital implant workflow? What do you need in your office if you want to do this yourself? Okay, so everyone needs a CBCT. Whether you take it, you send it to your local orthodontist who has a CT, it can get you to on a disc or a Dropbox, and then you need an STL. Okay, and an STL is a intraoral scan, is kind of the easiest way to do it. It stands for stereolithogram. It's simply a three-dimensional file. It's a Windows file. So there's STLs of everything. There's STLs of the Eiffel Tower and Baby Yoda and nuts and bolts and all this, but we need the file type STL of the teeth, showing the teeth and the soft tissue. So most of us are getting that through an intraoral scanner. Maybe you have a desktop scanner. You could, if you needed to, take a polyvinyl impression, send it to a lab, and have them convert it to a digital file for you. You then need to have a planning software, or your lab has a planning software that combines the two. So now we have the 3D X-ray and the patient's intraoral condition, and we overlay the two. You can see in that screenshot there that the lower STL has been kind of overlaid on top of the X-ray, and that's how we can kind of bring the two together. Okay, now we know how the tissue and the teeth line up with the bone. And then export everything, do the workflow I'm going to show you, and we can then download the surgical guide STL. Once again, just a 3D file that we can then bring into our Sprintray software, Rayware, and print. So then we can have it in-house. So first step, get your CBCT. If you decide to do some trimming, if we're working on the mandible, you could decide to trim the maxilla just so it's out of your way. Make sure you like the rendering, because we're going to use that 3D rendering So if we have a little bit of scatter, maybe we're going to slide down the Hounsfield unit that we want to be rendered, and then we're going to import the STL. So if you have a Sirona Prime Scan, or you have a Medit, or you have a Trios, you export that file and you bring it into the software. So in this case, we've got the lower, and then we're going to use the patient's rendering from their CT, and we're going to let the software know, hey, this hard tissue matches this hard tissue. Okay, we don't have gums in the CT, so we have to use teeth. So roughly line angles, cusp tips, things that are kind of obvious. And so if you have a patient with a lot of scatter, you might want to turn down that rendering so that you can see things a little bit better. Once you've picked enough points, I usually suggest 5 or 6 points around the arch, or many softwares now have an automated function for this, including the software you're looking at now. This is Acteon software. There's a button on the bottom left. You can see this says assisted. Very nice. It's nice when your software has that. You just click that button. It thinks for half a minute, and if it can line it up for you, it will. Once it's lined up, you or your lab, or maybe even a staff member, are going to be confirming that you like what's called the stitch. And the stitch is just how accurate is my intraoral scan overlaid on top of my x-ray. This is complication step number 1. This is checkpoint number 1. If this is not accurately stitched, your guide will not be accurate. And so on the bottom 3 slices of the CT, the axial, sagittal, and coronal, we're looking at the outline of our model and making sure that it's wrapping the hard tissue data in the scan. And so you can really appreciate it on the lower left in the axial slice. When the cusp tip pops into a slice, so does the model. We're wrapping the buccal and lingual and so on. So we're making sure we have a really good stitch, in which case we hit accept. If we're off by a couple tenths of a millimeters, your placement's going to be off by a couple tenths of a millimeter. So we have to be really mindful of that. Then you're going to go through your normal CBCT protocol to design, your panoramic curve. So in this case, we're doing the mandible. So we tell it where we want our panoramic curve to be. We go ahead and we map the nerve, right? Because we're working in the posterior mandible. We're certainly going to make sure the nerve is not a problem. In this example, it's very, very deep and very far away. And now we're going to select the site. So you tell the software, hey, we're going to work on number 19, and the software is going to allow you to choose an implant. Most of these softwares will have the library of just about every major implant brand. Until I loaded this software, I had no idea that more than half of these brands existed. There's just hundreds of them. So you find the implant that you're placing. In this case, we're placing a BioHorizons 5.2 by 12 Tapered Pro. And then on the right side, we're going to choose the guided sleeve. And so the sleeve, which is that portion that's hovering above the gums, is what is going to be printed into your guide, or what your guide is going to hold for you, where the drills will go through the sleeve. Okay, so whichever software you're using, you just have to know how to pick the correct sleeve, because it's going to tell you which drill to use, which length for the most part. Okay, so we've gone ahead and we picked that. We're going to reconfirm it in the software and just make sure, based on the model of the patient's intraoral scan, that we like the angle, we like the positioning, we can see the tissue, we can correct the depth, all of this. And then we move forward. Now we're going to make basically a working model to make our guide. Okay, so you or your lab will do this. You're going to select the path of insertion, very similar to a lot of things we've done, dentures, RPDs, right? So in my opinion, I like to kind of make it relatively parallel with the implant. It'd be nice. I also would love to see a little bit of the facial of all the teeth, so that my guide can wrap the facial of the teeth. And we're going to make ourselves an undercut model. And then you simply outline where you want the guide to be. Okay, so we're essentially telling the software the extent or the margins of our guide. We don't need to go into the gum line. You can go to about the height of contour in the teeth. You don't need to go beyond that if you want to make it completely tooth-borne. I don't like to wrap the distal most terminal tooth. So you can see in this example, I'm not wrapping the distal of 18. That's a point where I notice I get hung up a lot when I put the guide in. So I just go right across the occlusal, and then I'll go a little bit deeper on the edentulous span on the soft tissue, because I'm going to use that most likely to hold back my flap. Okay, I don't do a lot of punch flapless surgery. I'm a believer in keeping as much attached tissue as possible, so I still think we should be doing full thickness flaps for a lot of these. But if you are, make sure you have a little bit extra guide there to kind of pin your flap down for you, so you don't need an extra pair of hands. It's essentially going to make a suck down where you told it to. So now I have a night guard that covers 3/4 of the arch. And the little green circle there is what the software is telling me, hey, we're going to cut this hole out when you're all done. There's some examples and some options on the left to model this, smooth it, remove, add stuff. We can cut out windows. We can put names on it. So a lot of times I'll put the patient's initials and maybe the size implant so that my team know when they're printing 5 of these at a time, they can easily see whose is whose, right? So we can put a label on that. And then when you're all said and done, here's the example. My final has 2 little windows there that help confirm seating. I can export that quite simply and send it off into a 3D printer. I can email it to my lab, has a 3D printer, and so on, and get myself an actual physical model of it. Okay, so a really quick kind of 10 times example here of me using that software. It's about a minute-long video just so we can see, and this will pop up here in a second. We're going to get ourselves just a quick case to see. And I am usually also constantly referencing, the patient's photos and all this kind of stuff too. So, I'm not sure if that played. Apologize. Go back to that.
Dr. Vorholt, it's playing.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I just can't see it on my screen. So what you're seeing is me constantly referencing the patient's photography, and I'm making sure that I like everything right. Because when you do a guided surgery, of course, you want to place it exactly where you want it to go. So you're going to take your sweet time measuring everything, measuring the distance from the buccal plate to the implant surface, measuring the distance from the implant surface to the nerve, right? Making sure the depth is correct to the future free gingival margin. We're going to go for a screw-retained crown here, number 8. So we're going to make sure we're coming out a little bit palatal to the incisal edge. And Adam, if you could just let me know when that video's done, that'd be great.
Of course. Got 10 seconds left.
Okay, perfect. And so you're seeing all of the steps sped up 10 times. So this whole thing took about 10 minutes. And I think that's not unreasonable for someone who gets pretty comfortable with whatever software they're using.
All right, it's done.
Okay, awesome. So let's look at that case in a little more detail. Number 8 site, grafted site, so nice and healed site. We're trying to stay away from the nasopalatine canal, so 2 millimeters is your safety zone for nerves, and we're giving ourselves as much buccal plate distance as we can, right? And so if we zoom in and take a look, we can see our graft looks well consolidated, and we're satisfying all of the rules here as far as the distances. And our post-op CT then confirms kind of that what we planned is pretty darn close to what actually happened. So here you can see we're off by about 0.2 millimeters, which is well within what the literature says is accurate, but a lot faster surgery, more accurate perhaps than doing this freehand, right? So I'm happy with these results. And then after 4 months, patient returns for impression and final delivery of the crown. So I think that 10-minute guided surgery, you don't have to be doing the same day, but it also makes you a better surgeon because it forces you to choose where this is going, and you have to know why, right? You have to understand the biology at play, the restorative aspect at play. All of this is really, really important and makes you a better surgeon overall. So how about some pitfalls? Here, this is a guided case that I did several years ago where guide was in. I was at the time I was doing maybe 98-99% guided surgery, and I think now this is one of the reasons that I recommend not doing that. I recommend either getting used to freehand first or not getting so reliant on the guided surgery that you kind of lose the critical thinking aspect. And so I'll be the first to admit that at this point I just guide goes in, drills go through, implants go in, yada yada, see you later. And so it wasn't until the patient's impression appointment that I noticed that the angles were off. Clearly, these are not parallel, and they were planned to be parallel. So the anterior implant in the number 4 site is actually placed correctly. That's the one that we had. That's the angle we were hoping to do, and the final restorative plan was always to put a cantilever bridge off the 2. So number 5 has a pretty large horizontal defect. And as most of you can maybe start to already guess what happened here is when going back to the posterior implant, The pivot point became the tuberosity, and the soft tissue tuberosity obviously is not a hard tissue support, and so the guide rocked. And there's a window in the front, but perhaps we weren't looking at it, my assistant and I, because everything felt stable. And so the posterior implant got a little bit of a lean to it. And luckily it was still in bone, so of course it healed. And one of the rules of thumb is a poorly placed implant will heal every time. And so now you're stuck with a restorative compromise, and then maybe trying to get you have to get kind of clever here, right? So be mindful of what the support is on your guide. In this example, what I would do differently would I would probably wrap that guide a little bit further across arch. Maybe I would include part of the palate or put a palatal strap in there. I could have had a retention pin to help hold up that side in the posterior maxilla, or even done some sort of bone guide that rested on the flapped bone in that area. So there's a couple things looking back I would have done differently. Or I could have put the 2.0 in there, put the pilot in there, realized my error, and thrown the guide away and done it freehand. So at the time, like I said, just don't want people to get so comfortable or so reliant. Guides are an adjunct. They're not a crutch. You cannot let them become a crutch. So it was restored okay. I did a just 2 custom abutments and a bridge, but obviously a lot more expensive, and had to use cement and all that kind of stuff to restore it. So be mindful of that, just constantly checking. Another one of the potential pitfalls is drilling on a slope. And drilling on a slope is a very, very important concept to understand. And sometimes it takes a little bit of actually seeing this in real life to really have it click. So hopefully if some of you have placed many, many implants, this maybe will kind of ring a bell in your head, or maybe give you some insight. But when you're drilling on a slope, like in an immediate anterior site, or maybe a posterior healed site, like say the patient's missing 13, 14, 15, and there's a slope from 12 back to the posterior maxilla, wherever your most uphill portion of your initial osteotomy is going to be the most uphill portion of your final osteotomy. So in the example you're looking at now, the most palatal aspect of the initial osteotomy is going to be the most palatal aspect of the final osteotomy. Every drill will deflect down the slope. It's going to cut in the path of least resistance, and that means that it's going to cut where there's no resistance, which would be in this example on the buckle. So we need to overcompensate with this with the initial pilot drill to avoid this, right? And we don't want to perforate the buccal plate. So in a case like this, maybe you'll actually do it freehand if you're not comfortable doing this guided, or you position your guide to actually be a little more palatal than what your final is going to be, knowing that your pilot's going to get pushed down. Okay, so we'll talk about guided surgery and how we approach it in immediate sites like that. But it's an important concept to understand, is that when you see someone that has a broken down tooth in the anterior, you want to do it immediate, because immediates have been proven in the literature to be more successful and hold the hard and soft tissue better. So we want to do immediates whenever we can, right? So in a case like this, our initial pilot looks extremely palatal, and you might see that and think that can't be right. And so maybe you're not going that palatal, right? We should be like almost 3/4 the way up the palatal socket when we put our initial osteotomy, because as we continue to drill, you're going to see the drills appear to move more buccal. And what's happening is the osteotomy is widening buccal. So the final implant placement ends up being no more palatal than the initial osteotomy drill was done. So comparing the beginning to the final, and we see this is an ideal case, and you have to start more palatal than you think. So certainly we don't want to perforate the palatal plate. We don't want to be riding the soft tissue in the palate, but we have to really kind of overcompensate. If we go straight down the socket, inevitably we're going to actually be perforating our apex of our implant out the buccal. And we're usually doing these flapless too. So you might not even see it until your post-op CT. So in this example, the final right where we want it, and it's screw retained, final restoration. But hopefully that to some of you is maybe a pearl you can take away. So that was a freehand example. So if we're talking about guided, obviously tonight, so there's 3 ways to do anterior immediates. There's the Lindemann burr, which is the one on the far left. There's the freehand pilot drill. Those are the 2 techniques. You can use those 2 drills. But we're going to talk about the guided osteotomy preps. Okay, Steve, you just said that it's going to only drill down the slope. Well, if you're doing a guide, the big issue with the guide, of course, is that the hole for the guide is right over the center of your final implant. Well, I just told you that your first drill is going to be the most lingual. So how can you use a guide in an immediate case? There's a couple things you can do to mitigate it. Case selection is key, of course. So the number one here under guided osteotomy preparation, very simple class 1 sockets. A class 1 socket is one in which the tooth is in the middle of the alveolus. Most teeth are not. Most teeth are similar to what you see in this graphic where 80% of the teeth have a very facial proclination and the buccal plate's very thin and the root kind of swings up towards the buccal. But if you do have a class 1 socket, great. You can do a guided surgery no problem because you're just trying to go down the normal place of the socket. If you're doing a class 2 socket, make sure you have a brand new or a very sharp initial pilot drill. It's going to be really important. We also want to do some full speed pecking, I would say. So it's that lamina dura there, that denser part that you can see in this nice illustration. The cribriform plate is what deflects your drills. So if you've drilled any immediates, or even if you just drilled through a healed crest, you know that initial portion is the hardest. Once you slip through that, you're in the cancellous bone. Things start to slide a little bit easier, right? So we need to get through that cribriform plate without getting deflected. So my awesome animation here is showing us how we do full speed little pecs until you feel breakthrough. And you do this with every drill. So the 2.0, the 2.5, the 2.8, the 3.2, whatever your drill protocol is on your guided kit, you need to be really full speed but kind of slow. It's almost like you're doing endo, right? Like a couple millimeters at a time. Just make sure you don't go too fast and get deflected. That would be one of the downfalls. So we're talking about 3D printing and the Sprintray kind of ecosystem. And for most of us that are getting into 3D printing, if it's something you're trying to bring into your office to do surgical guides, certainly, because that's why I got it. But you can do so much with it now. Simple model work, right? We can print jawbones if we want to. We can do night guards, we can do dentures. There's new materials out that can be temporary or even maybe permanent restorations. So you're going to be looking mostly at that printer on the left, which is the black one, which is the Pro 95. It's your go-to workhorse. It's got a bigger build plate, which you can see kind of under the red glass is just a larger print area, so you can print more at a time. And it's also maybe not quite as accurate, but you don't need to be more accurate than 95 microns for most applications. The white printer would be maybe your second printer. You want to start printing final restorations. You want to start printing all-on-X provisionals. You want to do denture teeth that look a little bit smoother. You get the smaller but a little bit more tight accuracy Pro 55. Okay, and then on the right we have their wash and dry, and then we have their cure unit. And so you get the whole ecosystem for less than $10,000, and you can do so much with it. I always stress to people, even who aren't doing surgery, that 3D printing it's almost going to be necessary to keep up in dentistry, I think, because it just brings the cost down. It opens so many avenues for you to do things in office, and it's just so convenient. So I think it's a must-have, and for the price, it's probably the best return on investment of any dental piece of equipment, right? Most of us can. My first CT machine was $125,000, and the 3D printer is $10,000. Most things have a dental tax, and this doesn't seem to have it. So you have guided. You can fit a lot of guides. I think in this, I was just trying to see how many I could fit, and I got close to 11 or 12, and the total that I was printing was only 50 some milliliters of resin. And so even though the resin might seem expensive, you're buying it by the liter. So I'm doing 10 or 12 guides for about 40-50 bucks in total cost to me. So we're getting down into the couple dollar range per guide, and so that profit margin is really nice. And if you have to print a couple, or to print several models, or print extras, it's not a concern, right? So the return on investment is there for sure. So let's take a look at an example of a same-day guided immediate implant. Patient presents with just a fractured off tooth. We've all seen this, right? Anterior tooth, kind of a small root, root canal. She's probably about to go to a wedding or get married the next day, right? We've all been in this situation, so it's a bit of an aesthetic emergency. So go ahead and take an impression for a flipper or an Essex, and then maybe it's Friday. It's like, hey, do you have time to kind of hang out? We can take this out into an implant. And certainly you could do this freehand, but if it only takes 90 minutes to take the scan and get a guide, and you're already busy because you're squeezing her in, it just seems like a no-brainer. Let's make sure we put this in the exact right spot so that we know we can get a good restoration on the final. So we take a CT. We've got a small root. We got some bone above it, apical and palatal to it, which is pretty typical, the anterior. So we plan where I want our future final implant to be in our restoration. And we've got our guide. So this maybe takes 10 minutes, right? Like we saw earlier. So we're at 10 minutes right now. We export it and put it into the Rayware software for our 3D printer. It's going to take 39 minutes. And the nice thing about Sprintray is it takes the same amount of time based on the height of the print. So it's not so concerned about how much material you place. So if we go back to this slide, you look at the bottom left, the time is not much different. And it's probably because of this taller one I have in the corner. So if you do get into, let's say, Align or Ortho or something like that, where you're printing several models, the printer won't be running all day. You can do that in a matter of hours because the height is the only limiter, which is really nice. So now we got 39 minutes to print, so we're about 50 minutes, 49 minutes in. We're seeing other patients. Our patient's getting comfortable. She's filling out her medical history, maybe taking some pre-op medications we want to give her an hour before, and so on. Your staff takes it out, pops it right into the wash and dry. Takes 10 minutes. This high-powered thing has isopropyl alcohol already in it, and it's just kind of washes it for you. There's a fan in there that gets it really, really clean and really, really dry. Comes out of there and gets cured. So now you put your guide sleeve in, and the new ProCure 2 is a ton faster than what they had just recently released as the ProCure 1. So it's a 2-minute cure. So now we're less than 90 minutes. We're ready to go. So the patient's been seated. She's gone over the med history. You've talked about the treatment plan. Your patient coordinators talked about financing, whatever. And when you get in there, you're ready to do this fully guided. So onto the case. She gets, obviously, local anesthesia. We pull the root remnant. The guide fits. We have a window on the contralateral side just to make sure it's fully seated. So you should always have a window in your guides just to confirm that things are all the way down and passive and tight. And then we go ahead and we do our 2 drills and we place our implant. And so you can see the implant through the guide here. Of course, you got to take that photo if you're doing guided surgery, because that's the one that goes on Instagram. And then we take a PA to confirm our healing abutment's down. We graft the gap with cancellous bone. Easier to pack. You really can't fit cortical bone down there. And we want it to turn over, so we're going to do allograft, not xenograft. And then a little collagen plug or collagen strip just at the gingival margin to help seal the socket. She comes back in 4 months, and we have a screw retained crown. So she's restored with exactly the plan we had chosen, and wore an Essex in the meantime, right, for the wedding or whatever it was that she was going to that weekend. So it's a really nice thing to be able, once you get comfortable with the software and you bring this all in-house, you can do this in less than 2 hours. I mean, same day. And I did it a lot in private practice where someone would come in through hygiene with an edentulous site. Hey, we've thought about doing an implant. Yeah. Strike while the iron's hot. Let's get it done today. Go have lunch. When you come back at 1, we'll do the surgery. And so over lunch, that thing's printing. They get back right after lunch. You sit them down, you get them numb, your staff's cleaning the thing up, putting the sleeve in, curing it, you're ready to go. It's kind of a no-brainer. It just makes it so easy. So now once you've done this a couple times, you can start to leverage this a little bit, right? So now it's like, okay, well, I know where the implant's going to be, so now what else can I do? I can make custom healers. I can make custom crowns. I can pre-make some stuff because I already know on the software where everything's going to be. So I had the lab design some immediate temporaries. You can have them have it on a tie base already, so they know the implant's going to go exactly here. With this timing, this rotation, here's the thing that's going to screw right in. In this example, we actually printed this on the Sprintray in the Onyx resin, which is their new 45% ceramic resin, so it can be used as long-term temp or even potentially final restorations. And we did a Maryland winged, kind of a dual winged approach. So I had the model, I knew exactly where the implant was going to go. The lab designed this with a 4mm hole in the, quote unquote pontic, which is the future crown. And as the surgery goes forward, everything goes super easy. You can see the kind of flap design I use for guided surgery. I don't punch. So the guide in the top middle picture is kind of holding that flap back for me. Everything goes to plan. You put the temporary cylinder on, and this little winged temp slides right over it. Go ahead, we elute it together with some bulk flowable, and take it out of the mouth and just polish it up and get the contours right, make it nice and highly polished. And then this can go back to the patient's mouth, and they leave with a tooth that day. So it's out of occlusion, it's out of excursive, and so on. But now we're already forming the gingiva. We're not going to lose the papilla. We're going to gain papilla, and then we just take a final impression in 3 or 4 months. We're ready to go. So these are the kind of things that having this digital technology and the more comfortable you have, that you can leverage a lot of these tools to have a better patient experience. Your staff get excited about this. If you have any young staff, put them in charge of the 3D printer. My staff just ran with it, and they printed everything for me. I really never had to do anything unless they had specific questions. So if we want to make sure we're doing things prosthetically guided, and this is the last case we'll show here, we want to make sure we're pre-planning for the final restorative outcome, right? So we need a digital wax up, especially in a long span like this. We could go into the mouth and measure the full span and say, hey, a premolar is on average 7 millimeters, a molar is 10, 11. We could go in there and draw on the arch with a pencil. Or if we already have the STL, we could bring it into a software and do a digital wax up, or have your lab make a digital wax up for you, right? So now with our digital wax up before the teeth are going to go, we can plan our implant positions. This is going to be a 4-unit bridge. So we're gonna splint all of these implants together. And interesting thing about splinting long span implant bridges is you actually don't want the implants to be in a straight line. So you might be wondering, why is that middle implant like off to the buckle? And it's actually because we don't want to have one axis of rotation, believe it or not. So you don't want to have your 3 implants in a straight line. You're actually offsetting the middle implant to give a little more stability when the patient bites on the buccal or lingual cusps of this bridge, because if you can kind of imagine how it's a little bit more stable and it's not all rocking on the same axis of rotation. So confirming they're all nice and parallel, however, from the mesiodistal inclination, right? So we can make this screw retained. And in our guide, you can really see kind of the offset of that middle one in this guide. Guide goes, it's hard tissue behind it, so it's nice to have that terminal tooth, and it's wrapping to the contralateral canine. It gets printed. Once again, this is 5 milliliters, so a couple dollars, less than 40-minute print. Very, very simple. The surgery is done under a full thickness flap. It's a grafted site. The guide goes on. I still prefer to, if it's not a pinned guide, to place my 2 bows, take the guide off, put the parallel pins in. Get your PAs, make sure you love it. It's kind of one of those trust but verify kind of situations. So I've learned that my lesson from the one I showed you earlier. I don't just blindly complete the guide unless it's, of course, like a pin retained and you can't remove it. But I still think it's nice to take this out and just confirm that everything and the bone is right where the CT said it would be and all this kind of stuff. So 3 carriers to go in, place them all to the right depth, get that photo for Instagram, and then we decided to put a cover screw on these because it was grafted bone, so a little bit softer. And you can also appreciate that we're going for maximum spread, right? We're going for the minimum of cantilevers. If you're doing 4 individual crowns or you were just doing 2, you'd put the implants under the middle of the final restoration. For a bridge, you want to have no cantilevers. So we put our implants, we favor them on the far distal and far mesial here. Closure here with the mattress and a continuous. And then we have the plan slices and the post-op slices in a CT. So you can see that back implant. If that was a single crown, it might be a little bit tight to number 1, but we're intentionally getting as far back as we can. That still satisfies biology, right? So we can see all 3 look just like we planned them. Patient comes back, bone all healed beautifully. We take an impression, and we see our final 4-unit splinted bridge. Okay, so I think I think we can really leverage guided surgery, and it really comes into real fruition when you can leverage some technology in your office that's going to make this possible in-house. Get your staff excited about it, get your patients excited about it. I think a lot of doctors I know that have some Sprintray, they kind of put it on display. Maybe you have a lab or a steri and you have a glass window that patients can kind of see. It does kind of smell a little bit. You don't necessarily want the resin tank just like in the middle of your hallway. But I think patients get a real kick out of this when they see things being printed day in, day out, and they kind of know that you're high tech. So leverage it, man. Make it a marketing position. Make sure patients know. Make sure your staff give them tours, and you can go really, really far with this stuff. Like I said, it's probably the lowest barrier to entry when it comes to dental equipment, and probably the highest output. And every year there's newer resins and newer materials and newer ways to utilize this stuff. Okay, so thank you for your time. If you want to see more surgical stuff or more stories, I'm mostly on Instagram. It's at Vorholt DDS. I share a lot of stuff that we do down at Pathway in Tempe. So you might see some surgeries if you don't mind some gory stuff showing up on your feed. Shoot me a follow there. I answer most messages on there too. I'm pretty quick to get back to people. I have a website, personal website that kind of details my journey. So it'll kind of gives you it's a static website that just kind of gives you an idea of where I started, how I got to where I am, different courses I've taken. So I always get asked that question, how'd you get in the position you're in now? Because, I graduated in 2013, so it was a pretty steep ramp, and that website kind of explains it. And then if you're interested in taking live surgery courses with dental implants or even teeth, we now have a lot of exciting courses at thepathway.com. So I'll open it up to questions and then answer anything I see in the Q&A box, and otherwise I'll shoot it back to Adam.
Perfect. No questions yet. There's about a 10-second delay, so if anyone's got questions, go ahead and submit them through the chat or Q&A. I will do my best to fill the time. We did record the webinar today, so we'll get that out to everyone in the next week or so. If there are any questions, certainly feel free to follow or contact Dr. Vorholt, or you can email webinars@henryschein.com. Still no questions. You were just that good today.
I guess.
No questions.
I guess so. No questions.
No camera, no questions.
Oh, thanks,
Go
Matt.
Bucks. There you go. How often do you get a misprint?
Yeah, so John's asking how often I get a misprint. Very, very rarely. Once you calibrate that machine and your staff are putting in the right, you select the right resin and it knows. And nowadays, the new Sprintrays will actually preheat the resin for you, which is really nice, because one of the big downfalls of the early ones was if you had, like my room in Ohio where I had the printer would actually get kind of cold. And so sometimes you get misprints because the resin wasn't warmed up. And the new printers have tank heaters, which kind of helps to minimize that too. So you might get a couple misprints early on, and you can work with support, and they walk you through how to calibrate the machine. But I really don't see misprints hardly ever, which is great. Okay, I got a couple more here. So Jory, hey Jory, recommendations on digital wax up software. How do I find a guide design software that works with my scanner and CBCT? There's a lot of softwares out there now. Most CBCT softwares are starting to incorporate this into it. So we use Acteon, which is it's our CBCT, and it also allows now like modules for adding teeth. You can certainly use Blue Sky Bio. That's like a free version. You have to export your DICOM and bring it in, but then you can do wax ups. If you want to get really nerdy into it, you could go learn ExoCAD or 3Shape. A little bit more expensive, kind of a lab-based software. But any of those would work. But if yours has it built in, great. If not, Blue Sky Bio, ExoCAD, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Then Jory also asked, do you order sleeves from manufacturer and place them in the guide? I do, personally. I know some people that will edit the sleeve, or they'll edit the guide tube diameter in their software so that it's sleeveless. which simply means that if you have a key, it's going right into the resin guide, or you have a keyless drill, it's sliding right through the guide. They save themselves, $8 to $10 per site, and it's a little bit simpler because they're not having to process that. I've just always liked the fine tolerance sleeve on the drill it's made for. So when you do use the manufacturer sleeves, and Blue Sky Bio has sleeves too that maybe they're not OEM, but they have all the different sizes. You want to put them in before you cure it. So you put it in between the wash and dry and the curing box because it's going to shrink a little bit. So you want to make sure it's all the way seated. Yeah. With pilot only guides, you still putting metal sleeve in? Yeah. Once again, I do. Pilot drills are side cutting a little bit, so I would especially use it with pilot drills. I don't want my drill to take any resin shavings down the osteotomy. So, it's usually you're using it because you use tight space, and those sleeves are very, very small. So yeah, I'm still using a metal sleeve when it comes to pilot guides. List of equipment: scanner, printer, CBCT, etc. From Hader. We have several scanners at the office. We have the 3-disc. We have a prime scan. And we have 2 OmniCams, and that's what I use in private practice too. But there's scanners, there's so many of them, and they all work. I mean, you just have to make sure that you can export the STL from them. Printer, of course, Sprintray. CBCT, like I mentioned earlier, we use the Acteon Prime, which is a wall-mounted unit that's 12 by 10 field of view, and it's about 50 to 60,000, so about half the cost of my Sorona CT that I have in private practice. Yeah, it is time to come back to Tempe, Jory. It's been too long, man. Blender for dental, John. I'm not that much of a nerd. I'm a pretty big nerd, but I don't know that much. I know Baron Gretter and his good buddy did some stuff in Blender, like the anatomical profile generator too. And I've played around with that. And you can make night guards and stuff. Anymore, John, I think a lot of that's like cutting edge, where it's like people like Baron are doing stuff, and it's going to start to be incorporated into the bigger and bigger softwares. Like Sprintray now has Night Guard AI that'll create a night guard for you, right? And so they're kind of skipping Blender, and most softwares are trying to avoid needing you to export stuff out to Mesh Mixer and Blender, right? They're trying to bring everything into one platform, which is really nice. So I've opened Blender, and I just kind of blacked out because it was just really confusing. Monina says, how much training is it for your assistants to do the whole thing, designing and printing? It depends on the assistant. A lot of, I had younger assistants who were probably 19, 20 years old, and this was 5 years ago, and they took to it really quick. There's YouTube videos they can watch. I put them through Baron Gretter's YouTube videos, and I'm sure he's updated them since. Sprintray now has a new platform for new users and old users. They're going to release it soon. That has training videos, but my staff really kind of took it. They didn't want me to touch it because they kind of had their own thing. So when I did, for instance, when I did aligner ortho, I would get STLs of the models back, 30 models to print, and I would basically sign in and make sure I liked the ClinCheck or the version of the ClinCheck, and then they would take it from there. They knew how to access the Dropbox, how to line the models up to print well, how to clean them, trim them. They did everything. So as far as designing for the guides, I never let them do that because I was a little bit, I think I want to be the one who puts the implant in because I'm the one actually doing it. So I do think a DDS or DMD should probably be the one who has the final say on that. And then it's a couple buttons to get the guide from there. So it wouldn't really make sense in my workflow to hand it over to them after I got the implants in. Kevin asking what scanner I use. I already mentioned it. Prime Scan's my favorite. Of course, it's the most expensive, and maybe that's why it's my favorite. But it's just so damn fast and accurate. But any of the scanners on the market now that have been out in the last 2 years, and the price ranging from 15 grand to 80 grand, any of them are plenty accurate for this kind of stuff to get an STL of one arch or even a quadrant. So, okay, I think that's all the questions. So,
we got one more in the chat here.
Coming in.
What magnification do you use? Do you use socket shielding technique?
If you're talking about loops, I don't use loops. I think loops are they can make a surgeon a little bit too focused on one spot and not see the whole field. I also do a lot more full arch stuff. And I think the nice thing about my loops was the light, and so I actually now use Bilumix light, which is like a head surgical lamp, and they do have a 1.5 magnified kind of I don't know, it's like readers. I don't know how to say it, but like on the front of the light. So I use that 1.5. But I still want to see globally everything. So I want to see angles of teeth, arches. I want to see soft tissue hard tissue. I don't use loops. I know when we have people come down, to do surgery and they're wearing their loops and they look really long, I'll say, hey, how big are those loops? And they'll say 4.5, and I say, don't wear 4.5 loops. I think 2.5 is probably the maximum you need. We do socket shield. We have a course twice a year that Wade Pilling teaches. We do live surgery socket shields. I can see the benefit of loops for socket shield and that kind of minimal prep stuff, but I don't use loops for just normal surgery now.
Perfect. Another comment in the chat that just said loops mag also cuts down on depth perception.
Definitely. But you want the light. So you do want the light.
Perfect. Well, now I think we got through all the questions. Thank you, everyone. Little lull time, never hurt. Lots of questions coming in. Thanks again to Dr. Vorholt. Thank you to Sprintray. And of course, thanks to everyone for attending tonight. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we did record, so we'll get that out to you in the next week or so. Go ahead, follow Dr. Vorholt on Instagram. And lastly, if you're interested in our upcoming webinars, there's a little picture on your screen. Click that and you'll get our upcoming schedule. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
All right, thank you.